So is there something we can do in terms of, is this a gatekeeping issue, kind of? Is it kind of the government trying, because in other countries, I mean, let's say in the US, for instance, social media has sort of become this liberal conservative issue where they feel that there's a liberal bias to information that is moderated on their platforms. On the other side, we've seen there's a competitor to Twitter in the United States called Truth Social, which is another very similar platform, which is has a conservative bend.
Right.
Are we seeing something like that where is there anything the OSB, for example, through the enforcement mechanism, or let's say the commission that's meant to judge what is safe and what is not? Is there some sort of a gatekeeping thing that you or the commission, the Human Rights Commission, has seen?
So the Human Rights Commission statement on the online safety bill raises several issues, and one of the issues it raises is with respect to institutional reform and the need for reforming institutions because of the way existing laws are being implemented. But if I were to take my Human Rights Commission hat off and sort of comment more broadly on our media landscape, I think our mainstream media, and you would be better placed to sort of analyze this than me, but our mainstream media has been through many decades of repression in this country, right? And what happens with repression, and we've had various forms of repression also. We've had the more physical, straightforward repression that one associates with the 80s and the 90s, with even the 2000s, where journalists were assaulted, journalists were disappeared, murdered, news institutions and media houses were set on fire. We've gone through that history, right? And there's a legacy created out of that history where media institutions are survivalist. They need to survive in that space. And to survive in that space, there's often compromise in terms of how certain things are reported. And then there's a whole group of independent journalists that operate slightly outside that space that provide a more accurate picture of what is happening. And often these journalists and these activists, these civil society voices, don't use and can't use mainstream media, which is often a captured space. They need to rely on social media. And the fear here is that if you don't control social media, you can't control the narrative. And the online safety bill is often associated with that agenda to control the narrative. And I think that's what you were trying to get at, right?
Yes.
So there's this sense that in the lead up to many important political events, with the mainstream media, there is some level of cooperation that might be, extracted through pressure and through various means.
Right.
But when it comes to social media, it's such an unregulated, wild space. You need a new framework to bring it under control. And this is the framework that is being proposed here, right? And I'm saying proposed because it is such an ambitious task, right? A lot of the tech companies, the multinationals have said, you can't do what you claim you're trying to do under this law. It just does not, bode well, both in terms of our response, but also in terms of your technical ability to deliver such a vast, ambitious infrastructure to control the online space. And to answer your previous question, it's all going to boil down to this commission, the Online Safety Commission, that they're going to establish. That will be the arbiter of what is true and what is false.
And who appoints the commission?
It'll be the Constitutional Council. So one of the amendments that were brought in through the intervention of the Supreme Court was that the Constitutional Council will be the body that recommends appointments to the Online Safety Commission. And therefore, there would be assumed independence. But still, leaving aside the independence of the commission, you might have great commissioners on the commission. But the task is a vast and ambitious task where the commission would receive, a great number of vexatious and frivolous complaints from various people who don't like what they see on social media. And this commission will have to, separate those vexatious and frivolous complaints from the actual genuine complaints that deal with issues that require response. That's an enormous task. And then also the commission will need to decide what is a false statement and what is a true statement. And it's a very high threshold for what is false
and what is true. Isn't it?
How it's going to do that is anyone's guess. So I think this bill has not been thought through very carefully, and it's been rushed through. And many people, including the Human Rights Commission, urged the government not to rush through such a bill, because the intention to create a safer online space is actually a noble intention.
Sure.
It's a worthwhile pursuit, but doing it properly is very important. But when you do this kind of rushed legislative process, the chances of making mistakes are also much higher. And now people will be looking at this Online Safety Act that has been certified by the Speaker with a fine-tooth comb to see whether it has in fact complied with all the various observations and recommendations of the Supreme Court.
I mean, growing up, Gehan, it seemed to be like in the era of print, gossip existed. There were still things being written that you can't really clarify if it's true or not. So these were tabloids, essentially, right? So in a way, we've kind of ignored this. Tabloids still exist, at least abroad. It's even in Sri Lanka. There's plenty of tabloids. There's plenty of online internet websites that are essentially gossip sites, right? What about those? I mean, it's just so we are saying online safety bill. That's not specific to social media, is it?
It is, in the sense that social media and also online spaces are is the sort of main domain that this bill will deal with.
So will it attack gossip websites as well?
So offline content will not come within the scope of this bill. But anything, the online spaces or online location is defined very broadly. And it will include things like, websites. It will include things like chat groups. I just had a glance at the act that was certified by the Speaker. They've also included emails, SMSs, MMS within the scope of exceptions, but subject to further requirements to take down content within 6 months of the bill coming into operation. So that would mean that technically going forward, even one's emails will fall within the scope of this law. I think that has to be looked at very carefully, because that certainly wasn't in the original bill, and certainly wasn't the intention of the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court's determination was very specific, very, very explicit, that email services need to be excluded completely from the bill, as opposed to excluded with this caveat that content needs to be taken down in 6 months. So that's a problematic element, and I think people will be studying that to see what the outcome of that process is.
Again, a more general question, Dr. Gehan, how do you define what is harmful speech, or is that harmful speech the same as hate speech? How do you, I mean, just online, it's hate speech is defined as discriminatory, biased, bigoted, or intolerant, or pejorative. So, I mean, is there something specific about harmful speech? Again, I guess this is kind of similar to the question about insulting someone's notions of whatever religion or whatever, versus whether they incite someone. So, what is the threshold for what can be considered harmful speech? I mean, it seems a little, again, it's very vague. So I guess it comes back to the same problem, whereby you've given a very vague problem with very little specific rules and regulations to how to apply.
I think that's a great question, and the answer to that question is never going to be clear, because it boils down to usage, right? What we consider harmful will have objective elements in it and also subjective elements, and these types of definitions, terminology will evolve over time. Right? Very simply speaking, harmful speech is speech that causes some kind of harm. Then the immediate question is, what is harm? Right? Harm has to, it boils down to some negative consequence that people encounter as a result of
trauma come into this?
Yeah, it will be harmful, because harmful will also be subjective. The answer to the question shouldn't be getting a better definition for harmful speech. It's to ensure that we don't associate criminal law with harmful speech. Instead, we associate criminal law with a very specific subset of harmful speech, which is incitement. And then you need a very precise definition for incitement, which we have. The law does have a fairly good definition for incitement. So, and then there are guidelines that have been issued both globally and by the Human Rights Commission. Back in 2019, the Human Rights Commission issued guidelines on how incitement should be interpreted, a 6-part test based on the global standard. So to aid police officials, prosecutors, to have a very rigorous and robust approach to defining incitement, what is included and what is not. So there, because criminal law is involved, definitions are important. So the answer is not to have a more precise definition for harmful speech, is to ensure that we don't associate criminal law with harmful speech, but only associate criminal law with a very specific subset of harmful speech. For everything else, there are all kinds of remedies. Counter speech is one remedy. You have harmful speech that doesn't fall or doesn't meet the threshold of incitement. You might want to have counter messaging, where you resist that harmful speech with more speech. You might want to look at non-criminal law responses like civil damages. You might want to look at regulatory mechanisms, where if it's a broadcast of some kind, you might have a licensing regime that ensures that you don't produce and promote or disseminate harmful content. So there, having a more fluid definition for harmful speech is all right, because the consequences are not as severe as going to jail. Right? So I think that's a better way of approaching these definitional challenges than always seeking precise definitions, because that, as you well know, terminology, language, all of these things are subject to evolution, and you can't ever get society to agree on what constitutes harm, because it's such a subjective thing.